to CWS. CWS is about having conversations with people about their journey and how they are using their gifts and talents to help others. So I'm always looking for people who are doing extraordinary things or doing things extraordinarily well. This evening, one of the sons of our soils is our guest this evening, Dr. Aubrey Bonnett. And I'm especially happy because I'm always asking this question, especially today, when I look at the conditions of our region, our country, especially Guyana, and I look at the youth, and I often ask this question, where are our leaders? Where are our teachers? Dr. Bonnett is a professor, and I am excited to have him here tonight because he has made tremendous contribution to academia. He's made tremendous contribution to our diaspora and our country. And I would like to spend some time with him tonight with you to pick his brain a little bit. Get him to open up and teach us a bit about some of the things that he has written so prolifically about, like migration and micro-lending and transnationalism and all these wonderful things. Take a break. Dr. Aubrey Bonnett is currently a professor of American Studies at SUNY College at Old Westbury. He has been in the academy for over 30 years and has served on both coasts in various academic and administrative positions in the three largest systems of higher education in the country: the State University of New York, SUNY, the City University of New York, CUNY, and the California State University, CSU. He served as Vice President for Academic Affairs and Chief Academic Officer at SUNY College, Old Westbury for 6 years. The first Black Dean at the California State University, San Bernardino, where he also headed the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences for 7 years. Chair of the then nationally ranked Department of Sociology at Hunter College, CUNY for 3 years. You know what? Let me just bring in Dr. Bonnett because I would like to do a split screen with him as I read his bio. Dr. Bonnett.
How are you, sir?
Good evening, sir. You know, it's very difficult to chat with you without smiling because you're such a warm and, wonderful person.
Please call me Aubrey.
Thank you. That was going to be my next question. How may I address you tonight?
Please call me Aubrey or AB or Prof. But Aubrey is fine. Aubrey is really good. Really good.
Okay. Aubrey is the recipient of numerous awards from the states of California and New York and has served on the board of directors of many voluntary organizations in California and New York, including the Home of Neighborly Services, that's California, Concord Baptist Adoption Services, New York, and 100 Black Men, Nassau, Suffolk, New York. Aubrey received graduate degrees at the University of Alberta, Canada in 1969 and the CUNY Graduate School and University Center in 1976, an undergraduate degree from the Inter-American University of Puerto Rico, where he was Jesse Smith Noyes, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Noyes Foundation Scholar. He was a recipient of a postdoctoral fellowship of the Social Science Research Council, New York, a graduate of the Management Development Program, MDP, at Harvard University School of Education in 1988, and a finalist for 2 college presidencies in New York State. Dr. Bonnett is the co-author of 4 books and has published almost 100 scholarly articles in various academic professional journals and presented at numerous professional meetings. In addition to Caribbean Impact, he has published commentaries for Newsday, the New York Amsterdam News, as well as an online newspaper published out of Canada, Caribbean Graphic Online, and Carib Weekly. He lectures in the areas of African American studies, migration and transnational studies, micro-lending and economic adaptation among transnationals, contemporary American society, and additionally in the areas of social movements and protest and change in developed nations. His work in micro-lending, savings in developed societies, especially among West Indian immigrants, is seminal and is widely quoted in the academic and professional literature. He consults in the area of tertiary education, immigration, homeland security matters, both in the USA and abroad. Aubrey.
Yes, sir.
Impressive.
No, I'm just a regular fella from the diaspora trying to make a living in Babylon.
Oh gosh, your modesty is stunning.
It's so good to be here, Selwyn.
Thank
More
you.
so in the context of Caribbean American Month, let's say West Indian American Month, and the significance that holds for diasporic peoples, and as reflected first by President Bush. President Bush was the first, George W., and now recently by President Obama.
Aubrey,
Yes, sir.
can you give us a historical perspective of the Bonnets? And can you give us a glimpse into the life of Aubrey at 9 year old, a teenager, and who you became in your early 20s?
Well, I was born in the 1940s, and my grandparents were Barbadian, and they migrated, as many Barbadians did, to Guyana. And on my dad's side, he came from Buxton and ended up in Denver. And my mom died when I was 2 years old, so I really don't know my mom. I was raised by the folks on my mother's side um, in Cummings Street. I grew up in Cummingsburg, and when I left Guyana finally in 1963, I was living in Alberton. I had a pretty good existence. There were mainly women, which was a problem. I finally joined the volunteer force. Albert Pilgrim and I were in the same squad. To tough myself, I did the Tacoma walk and the whole works. Went to Comenius Moravian School. McGowan was my headmaster. I spent 11 years there, qualified at Government County, didn't qualify high enough actually, and my folks could not afford to send me to Queens, so I went to tutorial. Actually, Walter Rodney sat next to me for 3 weeks. Listen very carefully. And at that time, it was 1953. LFS Burnham was the Minister of Education in the combined government with Chetty Jagan. And Burnham wanted to give a scholarship to the person who scored the highest and who still had not gotten the different scholarships to Queen's College. And so after 3 weeks at tutorial, Walter Rodney was given the Burnham Scholarship and went on to Queen's. Walter and I were very close. We'd go to his dad's home, I recall, and Chetty was imprisoned actually in the prison infirmary and give the victory sign. And we continued our friendship up until just prior to his death, really. Went to tutorial, did my O-levels, got 8 subjects. I was quite young, I think at 15. Again, I could have gone to Queen's, and I didn't. I did go in the evening. I did my A-levels at Queen's at night school. I did 1 year at Bedford Methodist as a pupil teacher. I was maybe 16 then, yeah. Mr. Simon was from Regent Street was the headmaster. And at 17, I joined the civil service. Very interesting. I was assigned to West Demerara, magistrate Walter Parsram, for a year. And the person who had a tremendous impact on me and tremendous mentors was a guy called Horace Lincoln Mitchell, who was I had relatives who were also in the police force. His dad was a sergeant. And we called him Mr. Propriety. He just really took to me. And so we would do the West Coast run to Bergen-Ogan, the West Demerara. I had a cousin, Cornelius Powell, who was the dad actually of Nigel. He was actually at Lagrange. And then we do every 4 Thursday, the probation officer, myself, this commission would go to Christianburg, Mackenzie, where actually my dad was stationed for like 50 years. I left at that point I got to know Prime Minister Burnham. What I would do was if he had a major case in the city, for instance, I would put the case jackets at the very bottom and lie that they were there all the time and arrange with Arnold Molyneux, who was at Breedenhoop, or the sergeant, to get Burnham and Aston Chase and the other lawyers back over to the city. And if I was caught, it would have been really, really, really terrible. In any event, I left the courts. Before that, I got admitted to Lincoln's Inn, which was the inn that Magistrate Mitchell. I was very fascinated with law. I couldn't do math at all. It really hurt my chances initially. But I then joined the audit department, and I had my O-levels at the time. This was 1962, 63. I was given the government at the time was sending, we call them head principals here, but headmasters to study in Puerto Rico. Rolf Farley, who, as you recall, had challenged Forbes Burnham for the headship of the party and lost. Puerto Rico was seen as the Operation Bootstraps, the model for for capitalism in a developing country. And a number of economists, including Rolf Hardy, were there, A.J. Seymour, etc. And this was seen as a number of, political leaders were sending their children there. So anyway, the government chose two students, Michael P. Talmar and myself, to go with these teachers to go to Puerto Rico. To do so, we had to sign, or had to get somebody to sign that we'd return as cadets. And one Miss Dolphin, who knew my mom, Gertrude Dolphin, God bless her soul, she died at 106. She signed for me, and my cousin, Pyle. And so we left in 1963. I returned in 66, and weeks before independence, as a cadet in the office of the Prime Minister. Should have stayed for 3 years, but because I'd done favors for the Prime Minister, he allowed me to leave, actually, and I can say this publicly. And I had a scholarship he wanted me to join the Foreign Service. I didn't. I was working with Cecil McCurious and Bridget Hamilton. I decided to go he said if I want to do the Foreign Service, I could go to a university in Canada. I can't recall the name of it. But I'd already had a scholarship to Alberta and Manitoba. I figured that Alberta was less cold. There I met John Hines, the Prime Minister's brother, who was then an undergraduate, and David Applewhite, Romeo Rassol, and some others, and Fenton Ramsey-Hoy's son, brother, Paul. And I was trained by another mentor, Charles Hyman, who was a Barbadian. He was a developmental specialist, and I was torn between law and developmental specialty. So I did community and development with him. Did my master's, was going to my Ph.D., got married, and my wife said it was too cold. So I left and came back to New York in 1969. Taught at law school, and I spent a year with the city, the supervisor of research, came back, and met another mentor, Nelson Foote, who was a very brilliant industrial economist. He was actually stationed in Trinidad and was mentoring Wendell Motley, the athlete, and myself. And applied to law school, got into NYU just at the same time of the Attica Rebellion, but got really revolted at that. And Nelson said, why don't you come teach? You have to finish your PhD, of course. So I started teaching as an adjunct, working in the city, as I said, with a guy called Ted Gross, who was the commissioner of the Youth Services Agency at the time. And so in 1972, I believe, I started as an instructor at Hunter.
At Hunter?
Hunter College, yeah.
Barbie, hold on a second. I want you to indulge me a little bit in your early timeline. I want to go back to pre-independence.
Pre-independence, sure.
Because it's not often we get a chance to speak to someone like you who
has been there and has experienced a lot. When you think of pre-independence Guyana, what comes to mind? What type of sounds, for instance, music, aromas, foods, fruits? What comes to mind?
Well, as I said, my grandparents, my mom's side were Bajan, so I remember her doing the fufu, right? Lots of okros.
Oh, wow.
Coconuts, a number of coconuts, of course. What else? Music, the calypsos, of course. Calypsos was very, very... But still a certain sense of stability. There's not lots of whining, because, as I said, I grew up with... My uncle had died very mysteriously, so there were lots of women in the home. They were very strong women. Of course, my grandfather, my dad was in McKinney, so he's 65 miles away. But my granddad played the role in Loco of a parent, really. He was a Bajan for Christchurch. He'd take me to Christchurch, and he played that role very, very strong. So I would say that my childhood was unaffected. I felt, however, that at some point I'd have to toughen myself because there were so many women in my life. I did, as I said, by joining the volunteer force for about 3 to 4 years. Yes.
But you sort of experienced this concept of it takes a village, because just now you mentioned it was Miss Dolphin or Mrs. Dolphin who signed for you.
Sure, Miss Dolphin. Like I said. And that's a part of what I've tried to do. I've had tremendous mentors. Some, Wendell Bell, who was a mentor from Yale, and he's still a presence in my life. Nelson Foote, Um, One of the first black ambassadors, Hugh Smythe, who helped me with both he and his wife were ambassadors in 1960 in Malta, and Hugh and Mabel Smythe, he was in Malta and Syria, she in the Ivory Coast. But there's so many persons. I'm doing
I think I'm beginning to understand why you're so passionate about helping us and sharing your knowledge and so on with us.
because so many persons have done the same for me. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
even now, and what I've done, I'm not boasting about this, but be it folks who are presidents, who in intelligence, lawyers, judges, in both coasts, I mentor students. I mentor persons. I mean, I see this as a personal. My wife keeps shaking her head. So because I benefit so tremendously in all aspects of my life of her mentorship. And that's so important. All my friends, I'm still friendly with the guy I went to kindergarten with, frankly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Another timeline exploration. If there's a memory of a particular eventful pre-independence day in Guyana that sticks out, can you share it with us?
Yeah, I was very fascinated with public speaking. I recall, as I said, I lived in 351 Cummins Street. I played cricket with Roop Narayan. Roop lived in the court. Right next to me was the late Larry Alexander. He won the senior spelling bee competition. I was a runner-up for the junior. The word that I spelled was Epern, E-P-R-G-N. I still have a little cup, and it must be lost someplace. But, I really remember the day that Queen Elizabeth in 1953 went at Moravian with a little flag and the short. My wife and I were speaking about this, waving. She just gave the speech on the throne today. I remember when she was coronated. So there are certain events, going to Empire, the Pit, shouting when the lights were out, making the 20-mile march to Tacoma. Those are events that stand very, very vividly in my memory, in my mind, until now.
I wanna ask you a teenage question, a young boy question, so to speak.
Okay.
Did you ever sneak out to go swimming or do things that young boys usually do? I heard you play cricket, but
I certainly did. Let me tell you the swimming part. As I said, my uncle was he was in the then it wasn't called the volunteer force. I forgot what it was called. This was during the war, and he was a swimmer. He would I don't call it skiing, water ski, but he was brutally murdered actually in a trench in. So my mom forbade me for swimming. So I'd go to 40 feet with cousins of mine and jump in, and then get whopped after. So I have this vicious fear. Even in college, tried learning to swim, and I'd swim to the bottom. I still can't swim. So I remember those days, trying to swim and almost drowning in 40 feet. So yes, I remember that quite vividly. But also remember very, very vividly the speeches of Forbes Burnham. A very good friend of mine, it's fictive kinship. He's like family, Frank Douglas, who's really a brilliant. I mean, this guy's brilliant. We would go. He lived in maybe 270, just before the Roberts for Lamaha Street. I was right after Rico, actually. Ramson and his dad owned Cheeks. The Cheeks, who was a member of the United Force, lived just opposite me in the same yard. But we would walk to Border Green and listen to the fantastic speeches. Burnham was always the last speaker. Even though we didn't always agree with him at the time, Frank is a year younger than I, we had this tremendous ability to see what words can do. The ability of words to sway someone. And in the Dargan debates, Mike Talmar, myself, and Joe Lester competed against Walter Rodney, I think Colin Moore. We didn't win, of course. We got to the quarterfinal and got beaten. I was always fascinated with words and the ability to deliver your point. That's why I was kind of skewed towards law, but I do some of that, of course, in the profession that I chose.
Talking about words and some of these scholars that you've called, whose name you've called just now, I want to take advantage of this moment and ask you a bit about the late Forbes Burnham and his speeches.
Yes.
I know I grew up at a time when he was president, and I've been moved a lot by some of his speeches. But you were close to him, and you worked with him. You listened. You heard a lot of his speeches pre-independence. What can you say to those of us or the young folks who have never heard him speak? How would you summarize this speaker, this orator?
Biographically, he won the Speaker's Cup, as you know, in London. So I mean, he was validated by the best of the best. I mean, you can check, you can Google it. You can Google it. So here's a guy. Here's a guy. I recall when the party had split. Let me add that many of my mom was actually with the former the party when they were all together. Margaret Ackman. They actually met at my house. Listen carefully. In 1953, when the Constitution was suspended, I was woken up, and with my mom, I was tearing up the membership of people like Harper Smythe and others who were Creoles who were high in the government and flushing it in the water closet. So the party was all together then. So he runs for election, he loses, and I guess many of the supporters were really downtrodden. I was actually in between, I was quite young at the time. But you could see when he began to speak, he was always the last speaker, the tremendous and the fervent hope in the minds of people as he gave them a sense of hope and a feeling of responsibility, and that at some point their victory would come. So Burnham was a tremendous, he was a transformative speaker, almost like Fidel Castro. And he never spoke as long. He didn't have to. And as I said, working at first as a clerk of court, I saw him give orations, right, in the magistrates' courts. And I also had a chance when I came back, and I was one of the early graduates, American graduates, to work, actually the first, in the Prime Minister's office as an administrative cadet. Most graduates at the time were coming from England, right? There was a stuff against American graduates per se. So I was one of the first, and later Aubrey Armstrong. The Armstrongs kind of maximized this. But I worked with him in bringing about what's called a community independence project, and I'd like to talk
Aubrey,
about
hold on a second. We're having some problems with your volume. And I'm at a loss actually trying to figure that out. Do you have a volume control on your computer?
I do. Yes.
Can you turn it up as much as possible?
Okay, I certainly will.
Mm-hmm. Because I'm hearing you, but if our audience not hearing you properly, then that defeats the purpose. You're using Windows, I presume. What version of Windows are you using?
I don't even know. I go to Tools, I guess, or Tools and Options, right? Yeah. Tools, Options, and it's. Are you hearing me now?
I can hear you. It's the audience that I'm concerned about.
Okay.
How
about now?
Let me ask them.
Hello?
Let me ask if it's better. Okay, can someone tell me if he's better?
Hello?
Say something.
Hello?
We can hear him, but our volume is at max.
Hello?
It can work. Okay. All right. Let's continue. Daryl said it can work. So let's try that. Hold on.
Yeah, I was saying that I got back just before independence, and I suggested to the Prime Minister actually that we have these community independence projects, and what it was the government would place 1/3 of the cost, would bear 1/3 of the cost. The foreign donors, the Canadians, the Brits, the Americans would bear 1/3, and 1/3 would be borne by the indigenous people. And they would decide whether they wanted to build a creche or a watermill. And I left, as I said, in soon thereafter, 3 months. But a year after, 60%, almost 70% of those projects were completed. So I think that's a very good platform when we speak later of diasporas and different platforms. A platform of getting people in the host country invested in their own development.
Talking about that, Aubrey, as a historian and sociologist, rather, what does home mean to you?
Home means a place where the original values, and be they political values or economic values or educational values, are honed, okay? And those values can then be maximized in the diaspora, okay? And they can be maximized educationally, economically, socially, and culturally. But home really is the source, the initial source, where many of those values are honed and are created.
Why wasn't And in the context of independence, why wasn't political independence and nationhood able to set the stage for improved economic situations and significantly alter the economic relationship with their former masters or metropolitan masters?
Well, independence really was just not just, independence was a political transformation. Economically, there were years, it's almost like 40 acres of mule here, and the Reconstruction period. It was such a long, elongated period of servitude and economic bondage that independence per se could not change that. And I think that might have been the effervescence and the euphoria which infected so many of us. We felt that with the changing of a flag and the name, that economic salvation or nationalism would follow. That never really happened. And unfortunately now it's even less so because of so many intervening variables. But independence was necessary. I feel, although sometimes I wonder. But yes, we needed that break politically.
Mm-hmm. Uh, and what are some factors you kind of alluded to some factors here just now, but what are some specific factors that precluded this new political autonomy from translating into economic viability?
Well, some of the factors are external. The fact that the plural nature of our society was used against us. The split between the founding fathers, really, of the Republic, Forbes and Chetty, both Jagans, really, not just Chetty. Members like Ashton Chase, Ivan Van Sertima, Clinton Wong, Ulrich Ray met in my home, okay? And like I said, in 1953, I was stirring up stuff in the first. I was at Walter Rodney's home when Chetty was arrested and placed in the prison infirmary. So I saw the unity, the effervescence in this land of six peoples, and this is what we are. Okay, I saw that effervescence as a young man, but that was cruelly destroyed by the British. And now, just 2 weeks ago, we see many of those M16 papers being declassified. Okay, we know on the other end that here, at that time, the English power was waning, and again, John F. Kennedy actually told the British that he did not want another Fidel in the South American continent, and this allowed Forbes Burnham to be again to be utilized as a person contra against Chetty Jagan. So what I'm saying is that there were external factors which really maximized and led to the rupture which still exists in Guinea.
I'm curious about something, Aubrey. If you may indulge me.
Sure.
What was the British fearful of?
The British were that fearful, quite honestly. The British actually felt that the British knew that Forbes was smart. I mean, that's no doubt. But actually, I'm going to paraphrase now. The British felt that Forbes was. They said he was an opportunist. Not very flattering terms. He was sycophantic. But Americans were that the British were no longer in control. England had just actually lost the war. It was saved by FDR. Okay. England had been devastated. Okay, and power had shifted to this new power in the late 20th century, which was the U.S. of A. And they were concerned with the rise of Fidel Castro. Okay. And they did not. It's declassified now. John F. Kennedy said, "I don't care what you say. We will not have another so-called communist on the South American continent." I have before me right here a picture of Prime Minister Chetty Jagan speaking to John F. Kennedy in the White House on the 25th of October, 1961, where he's trying to convince them. And you could see Kennedy's face. This is visual, looking very skeptical. So Chetty did his very, very best. But they did not want a so-called communist in South America, and that laid the way for Degar and anyone but Chetty, right? So in a sense, Forbes's entree to the political elite was facilitated by this strong distaste for communism. And that's part of the Monroe Doctrine within the Western Hemisphere.
As a historian, not a revisionist, how did that affect our nation's socio-cultural and socio-political evolution?
Oh, tremendously negatively. I mean, that split has still. that split still revolves in our society. It has never been repaired. It's never been, people say I'm a religion, but it's never been repaired. We're a land of six peoples. You had slavery, you had the abolition of slavery, the emancipation of blacks, owning villages and refusing to work, and the bringing of indentured servants, really, which broke the position, the economic power of slaves by bringing not just East Indians, Chinese, Portuguese, etc. Okay, and hence the villages failed, most of the villages. Okay, and the movement of African Afro-Guyanese to the cities. Okay, and the urban thrust. But we have never been a united people since the split was engineered. And for that, I blame the Americans, really.
The Americans.
Yeah, I mean, not I, every historian, my friend I'm forgetting his name now, from Harvard, just wrote a book on this. And every historian agrees on that point, that the Americans played a very, very...
Let's shift a little bit to Trinidad, who is also a plural society.
Sure.
And with Dr. Williams. Trinidad at the time, I understand from some writings, that did not suffer a similar split. And the consensus is that because Trinidad had certain symbols like carnival and calypso for the people to rally around, and that sort of helped to unite them. What are your thoughts on that? Is that so? Did the Americans not interfere? Well, let me phrase it.
What happened was during the war, and there were bases. We had Atkinson Field, Chaguaramas, but Trinidad also did not have the East Indian population. Trinidad is not as large. Okay, mm-hmm. There's a large amount of Muslims than there are in Guyana. But also Eric Williams, even though he was a nationalist. Eric taught he went to Oxford, but he taught at Howard University. He did not have the nomenclature as a communist. And Americans were tremendous, it's almost like being a terrorist now, tremendously afraid of communism. And you got to remember, the Bay of Pigs and Castro, who claimed he was not a communist and changed his mind, and it might even have led to the death of President Kennedy. We don't know. But so Trinidad they're not equal plural societies, yes, but their leadership was not threatened and fractured as the leadership was in Guyana.
Gotcha. You spend a lot of time, or you spend time in cyberspace. I know that for a fact, and in many forums on socioeconomic and socio-political discussions about Guyana. What do you believe, if any, is missing from the discourse about nation building?
I think Guyana has not been able to, what I call centripetal forces, forces that bind us together. And you find this normally in different platforms, in old boys associations, QC or Bishops or Tutorial or Central or St. Joseph's. Those associations, they go beyond, almost like social class, they go beyond race and ethnicity, okay? And we haven't been able to build many of these. And that's one of the things in my field, in the field of social sciences, they're called hometown associations, professional associations. Being a physician or media specialist, you tend to focus on those secondary associations as being very, very important. So your race doesn't really matter, okay? A person's ethnicity doesn't matter. It's more maybe social class might have a greater bonding in that respect. But we haven't been able to transcend that. And because there's this tremendous entrenchment in ethnicity per se, and ethnicity is reflected in governments. Okay, if it's not the PPP, it's the PNC. As I said, I recall when United Force was DCJ Bob and Mr. Cheeks, who was my neighbor, became again used to abort the thrust of communism. So that's been Guyana's problem. We haven't built those kind of centripetal organizations, and it's a challenge.
You've written numerous articles on your studies of the West Indian immigrant,
sure.
West Indians, remittances, the West Indian diaspora in America. How do we begin to understand the Afro-Caribbean diaspora in America?
Well, you've got to look at, again, the home, Africa. And one aspect that I've done is look at Susu, which is actually what I did was I replicated the work of a guy called Ivan Light. Ivan Light is a retired sociologist, economist from UCLA, who done work on Koreans and Chinese on the West Coast. And they have a similar organization. They're actually called ROSCAs, Rotating Savings and Credit Associations, ROSCAs. If you Google it, you'll find that it's very, very prevalent in terms of micro-lending and building and forms of credit, and used by, it's not only instrumental, but also expressive. For instance, when you have a throw, you take the throw to the banker and you get, so they're actually used for both instrumental and expressive purposes by immigrants. And so what I did was I replicated this guy's study or his work here in Brooklyn, in the West Indian American community. As I said, my mentor then was Hugh Smythe, who was one of the early black ambassadors, and he himself was a developmental sociologist. So he helped me tremendously in getting the study, and it really took off. So if you look now, this stuff is mainstreamed in economics and ROSCAs. If you Google ROSCAs, you'd find my name in most of the literature. The Federal Reserve Board in Canada and England. Again, it's used by Chinese. To build homes. And this also helped Caribbean immigrants here in building homes, maximizing assets, okay, building homes and sending their kids to colleges. Colin Powell talks about this. What I also found was the differential usage, that the first generation used it to buy home, what I call for instrumental purposes, buying homes, sending kids to school. The second generation, Powell's kids, who the first generation born in America, they call second, and their would use it for more expressive purposes, going to Club Med. So there's a differential usage or utilization of these associations. But they've been very, very, very instrumental, not just for us, but for Koreans, for Chinese, for Indians, and for other groups who've used them successfully. So that was one of the studies, one of the areas that I'm known for. My early work on these organizations.
What are some factors that have to be in place to, and I guess we have to make a SUSU work, but I guess where I'm going with this is because
it's got to be trust. If I'm gonna leave my mom through that for a number of years. She was a seamstress that came here, did nursing in her old age, passed chemistry, and she was a nurse for years until she died. Up the street, Lefferts General. I grew up in Crown Heights, Brooklyn Avenue, and she was the banker. Most bankers were women. So it also gave women a sense of salience or importance, right? Mm-hmm. And so let's say you have 10 persons. If she's a banker, didn't know me or didn't know you, she'd ensure that you get the latter hand, because if you got one of the early hands and used it for whatever purpose, to buy a home or brownstone, and didn't repay, you couldn't take you to court. There's no common law precedent for this, right? Of course, in the Chinese culture, you'd find your hand floating in the East River. But Caribbeans, I mean, you can stigmatize a person by bad-mouthing her in a nursing station. So to prevent this, and this is common in the literature, you found that people who weren't known for the first two hands would often get the hands towards the end of the end of the.
Oh, so there was a system, huh?
There was a system, sure, a system. It was a system, and the banker. Now, after the second or third time, then you. So when you get in your hand as number 10 or number 20, you're in a sense giving credit to the people who get their hands earlier. Okay, so you're providing them with credit to open a beauty parlor or you're giving them tremendous credit. When I came back from California to New York, I got a call from somebody in one of the banks. I do some consulting in this area, and he was concerned because George Bush's dad was trying to maximize home ownership, and many persons were using SUSUs, but he found that those who were using SUSUs as their down payments were also, this was 1994, 95, were also defaulting and more quickly than persons who were not using this and he wanted to know why. And of course, I gave him advice in that regard. There's another case where a major law firm, which I can't state, might have been 201, 202, had a case where this lady was with somebody from Africa, and this instrument came from Africa, West Africa, and it was involved in some theft. He had flown back to Ghana, and the district attorney from Manhattan had charged her, and she said, well, look, I've got this money, I got it from Susu. And they said they knew my work, and they wanted to hire me as a defense attorney. I had worked also for the prosecution, U.S. attorney in many instances. So I said, fine, I'd work for the district attorney. The district attorney's concern was, how come she would have $2,000 for one hand, and then the next hand it would be 4? And And they couldn't understand. They said, it's got to be the stolen money. So I had to explain to them that you can double up. You can double your hands. And so the way Susus worked, we was able to convince the defense attorney was able to convince this attorney Morgenthau, and the case against her was finally dropped. So I've been doing some consulting. On the other hand, I did some work in the U.S. District Court in Philadelphia for the prosecution. Here again was a Jamaican person who worked outside, sold stuff outside of McDonald's. She was a courier for drugs, and she had a large amount of money, and she claimed she got it through Susu. I was able to show that for the large sum of money which it was, she could not have gotten it through Susu, because to do so would have meant throwing a hand of $1,000, and she clearly was not doing that. So she pled guilty and was convicted, and the money was seized, and she was deported.
Aubrey, let's take a quick break. And
Okay.
but before we go, I want you to think about this question: what is the purpose of a good education in the diasporas, and especially in the context of Caribbean American Month?
Sure.
All right.
Culture and transmit knowledge. Actually, the whole Platonic concept, educo, means from, out of, duco meaning lead out. So the notion was that you had these caves of ignorance, and what education did was really transmit you or transfer you out of these caves of ignorance. So education really, that's its basic function in whatever form, all right? Whether it be in medicine or law, the professions, or the social sciences, history, education does that. It transmits the culture and provides for a certain base or platform for individuals to improve themselves. But education also has a larger nationalistic function. And in the terms of the Caribbean, I think in my day, the major stuff was law and medicine. Everyone was doing lawyers or doctors, okay? We need to have more focus on tourism, okay? More on the arts, okay? Linguistics, okay? Paraprofessionals. We need to maximize the avenues of paraprofessional education in the Caribbean. That really hasn't happened. I think Jamaica does have some technical colleges now. One is actually headed by a brother of a colleague of mine. But we need much more of this in maximum technical institutes. We need much more of that in the Caribbean, much more.
You went into teaching, but when did this passion for history evolve?
I would say as a student, back in Guyana, I had some very, very good history teachers. As I said, I did my A levels in British Constitution and history, okay, and my O levels, I got distinctions in history. So the fascination, I read tremendously. I'm an avid reader. My students could tell you, I'm always reading. And not ebooks. I get the actual books. I'm going to retire very shortly, maybe in another year or so, and then I've got to decide what I'll do my books. I understand that the books sent to the UG, they're not picked up or not properly stored, but reading really opens the mind. Okay, whatever your profession, if you're a lawyer, a doctor, educator, a media person, you've got to read. You've got to read. And you can't just read song bites. You got to see what's the thrust of this article. What's the person's argument? Do you agree with it? And I try to transmit that. That's how I was certainly trained in the Caribbean, certainly. And this was maximized as I came here by my many mentors.
Aubrey, can we look at the diasporas and the transnationals and how they affect development in the region? What is the role of the diasporas and transnationals in contemporary immigration?
That's a very, very good point. First of all, what are transnationals? Transnationals are persons who fit in between both worlds, both the host society, okay, and the sending society, okay. And this could not happen before. It's really a trend of contemporary immigration. It's facilitated by technology, okay. It's facilitated by the ease of transportation, all right. So in a sense, transnationals are biculturals. They're planted in both worlds. Before, that caused tremendous marginality. So you were of neither culture. And also you had a tremendous push towards assimilation, all right? This did not happen in the in the late 20th century, as we had this push towards what's called cultural pluralism. Persons felt easier keeping their culture. And as I said, with the rise of expediency and technology, transnationals began to emerge. Now, in terms of the Caribbean, there are many platforms. There are political platforms of transnationalism, economic platforms, there are social platforms, Caribbean nation, carnivals, that kind of stuff. Remittances is an economic platform. A political platform would be dual citizenship, where persons, not just us Indians or Canadians or Israelis or Dominican persons of the Dominican Republic can vote in their elections. All right. Now this occurred, for instance, the ability on a political platform for transnationals to be involved in the electoral system in their countries. That happened in Guyana. As you know, we had overseas voting on the Forbes Burnham. You recall that, do you, Selma?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and some would argue that was the way in which Burnham was able to maximize or to retain power. So there might be some reluctance to go that way again. But in the Dominican Republic, I think the current president actually is a resident, is an American citizen out of New Jersey. I think that platform has to be utilized because right now Guyana has the largest out-migration rate. So in terms of political platform, there needs to be more there. There'll be some distrust at first, and so that we can see some hesitancy. Economically, remittances, again, Guyana remittances are quite high in Latin America, China, India, but for the Latin American area, Guyana ranks pretty high in remittances. Not just cash remittances, but also in kind. La parking or sending barrels home. That's become a tremendous source of funds. We need to go further than that, though. Why can't we have diaspora bonds, or ways in which people in the diaspora can build hospitals? This happens with, for instance, with faith organizations, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, or Catholic Church. The diaspora can do so. It has been done in other diaspora contexts. So that's the way in which we have to look at the different platforms, but that will only happen, Selwyn, if there's trust. Right now, that trust, even here in New York, the trust between Afro and Guyanese, there's not a lot of association. There's some organizations like the Guyana Cultural Association that tries to maximize this and does an extremely good job, but we tend not to really mix and mingle as we should, and much of it, I suspect, is the residue of what's happening in our country.
What, in your opinion, was some driving forces behind the massive immigration from the 50s up?
I think the major factor was the pull of the failed promise of economic nationalism. That didn't happen. We had a political independence, but the economic, we were told, did not follow. And so instead of coming, England was no longer a major power, so persons decided to come to the US of A and Canada. And they were looking for the same thing that everyone looks for educational salience, right? For economic maximization, which they did, and to be able to better themselves. So the pull was very, very, very strong. Mm-hmm. And of course, there were problems. There were some problems in the sense that in the late 20th, early 21st century, the shift changed from America became a more what's called a service society. And this meant that women nurses and women began to come over, nannies more frequently, and many times leaving their kids back home and sending remittances back. But this brought a tremendous strain between male-female relationships in many regards, okay? And we're now seeing the effects of this in terms of parts of the diaspora, East New York, Crown Heights, where we find the absence of the male, especially among black families, not solely, I mean, it happens among East Indian families too. The absence of the male has been a major negative factor in terms of upbringing and the rise of gangs.
What about the Guyana diaspora? What are your thoughts on the current Guyana situation, if any?
I think, as I said before, Guyana is still a politically split society. There needs to be a greater need for centripetal, and it's a fancy word for meaning organizations like professional associations, Guyanese doctors. I have a very good, my high school buddy, Dr. Bertie Saunders, he's going in October. He goes every 3 months and gives his service, not just him, but he and a bunch of other Guyanese. They go to Haiti, they go to Grenada, and they go to Guyana. He's going in October. We need to find tutorial or Queen's College or Bishop. We need to find more of that solidarity bond which transcends race and ethnicity. And the government has to do much to facilitate this. Now, the government does have a unit within the Foreign Service, I believe, and this was actually pushed by Prime Minister P.J. Patterson in 2007 at Medgar Evers, when he said that facilitating the diaspora in the home country is a maximum effort and has to be done. And at the time, I think President Jaggio was president. I actually saw him at the time in Barbados, right after President Bush had declared Caribbean American Month. So we need to move more in this direction, but it will only happen if there's trust. And that trust really, so far, is not maximized in the Guyanese situation.
What are some challenges in repatriation?
Well, the major challenge, people of transnationalism, the major challenge in transnationalism are terrorism, crime, organized crime, okay, and narcotics, okay? And we see that not just in Guyana, in all fairness, in Jamaica. Let me listen carefully. One of the early uses of drones, I'll repeat, one of the early uses of drones in the Obama administration was in Jamaica when they got dudas, okay? Obama used that, Jamaica, and the Drug Enforcement Agency is part of the Jamaican situation. I do some consulting in that area, which I can't really be more specific on. But there's always been a flow of Guyanese sent back home who've been accused of dealing in drugs and deported, all right? And that, post 9/11, that's been a major challenge in the diaspora. It happened even before, when Colin Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and on the President Clinton, we meaning America, had loaned some ships to Barbados. But Guyana is a major transshipment force. A colleague of mine, the now president of Fort Valley State College in Georgia, Ivor Griffith, has written quite extensively on that area. That's still a major challenge for not just the Guyanese, the Haitian diaspora, less so in Barbados, very heavily in Trinidad and also in Jamaica. A major challenge for these micro societies is the drugs. And in the context of America and terrorism, there have been some Caribbeans who are doing life here for terrorist ventures. That's a major challenge which we'll have to work to overcome.
I am curious about the leadership in the Caribbean. And I want to ask you this question, if it's a fair, I hope it's a fair question. How does the current cadre of Caribbean heads of state line up with those from the post-independence, the likes of Grantley Adams, then Errol Barrow from Barbados, LFS Barnum, Dr. Chetty Jagan, Eric Gary, Dr. Eric Williams, Michael Manley, et al.?
Not good at all. Listen to me carefully. I have the utmost respect for Forbes, for Chetty. I might agree with all their policies. Who does? But Grantley Adams, Errol Barrow. I've studied these figures. These guys, they made errors. So did John F. Kennedy and Jimmy Carter. But to me, they had basic principles, all right, and principles of governance, okay. And these guys now are just out for themselves. Ralph Gonzalez, I think he's on the right track. I have tremendous respect for Norman Manley, okay, and Michael. Michael, I knew. I worked. One of my mentors. We had this affair every May in which the Democratic Socialist Alliance, which held at the Graduate Center. That's when I met Walter for the last time. And Michael would come and become involved in that. Actually, my wife has the picture of his obituary in our bathroom. But I think the older leaders were much more in tune with what the nation wanted. Unfortunately, they could not deliver economically, and I don't blame them totally.
Talking about that leverage, I'm curious about something else: egalitarianism. Speaking so highly of them in comparison to the current cadre,
right?
Do you think they were capable of developing egalitarian societies, or were external forces or even character flaws stacked against them?
it was a tough. Well, yeah, they made some noble efforts.
Okay.
Look at the way the way Forbes Burnham worked with Sir Ramphel. That was a very classic relationship. Okay, Ramphel was seen as one of the best public servants in the Caribbean. He was head of the Commonwealth Secretariat. Okay, when I went to Canada, one of the top guys there was Neville Linton. He was actually head of the International Relations Institute at UWE in Trinidad. He made the president of Alberta wait for this guy. I'd never forget this stuff. And so we've got tremendous talent, not just Guyana, in the Caribbean. The question is, how is it utilized? Many of those guys never stay. I said Rolf Farley. Rolf Farley ran against Forbes for the presidency, the head of the party. He lost, and he moved on to Puerto Rico. So that's the problem, the staying power. At the University of West Indies now, we've got a Guyanese heading it. We had Compton Bourne at the Caribbean Development Bank. There needs to be more. Guyanese do lots of stuff, but they're not very boastful. I mean, they do it very, very quietly. I'm not going to say boastful as opposed to whom, but there needs to be much more mentorship of young Caribbeans. We need to broaden the base of education, do more tertiary care at the community colleges. More paraprofessionals, nurse practitioners, that type of stuff, and that will help our society tremendously, I feel.
I want to take another break, but I want to leave you with this question. In your opinion, could the Federation have lasted without Dr. Williams' decision to pull out after Jamaica? When you are in front of an audience, pushing your cause, do you feel her presence? Do you channel her?
Yes, I do. I speak with her before, mostly if I can get a chance with her, I talk about what I'm doing, and she just prayed to me, what has came on to you is a present that was given to you by God, because that's what we want as human beings, is to speak up for each other, is to care for one another, is if somebody is being done wrong or somebody is dying or starving, you're able to speak for them. That's love. So when I speak with my mother, she's always telling me this. So I feel it when I speak up for what's going on in South Sudan, or for us to have a voice, have an education in our country.
Dr. Bonnett, Aubrey, sorry.
Aubrey.
The question is, when you are in front of an audience, pushing your cause, do you feel her presence? Do you channel her?
Yes, I do. I speak with her before, mostly if I can get a chance with her, I talk about what I'm doing, and she just prayed to me, what has came on to you is a present that was given to you by God, because that's what we want as human beings, is to speak up for each other, is to care for one another, is if somebody is being done wrong or somebody is dying or starving, you're able to speak for them. That's love. So when I speak with my mother, she's always telling me this. So I feel it when I speak up for what's going on in South Sudan, or for us to have a voice, have an education in our country.
Dr. Bonet, Aubrey, sorry.
Aubrey. Okay.
The question is
Whether a society
right.
is
The federation, right? If Dr. Williams had not pulled out shortly after Jamaica, would it have survived, and what would have been the economic and political trajectory?
That's a very good question. One of my mentors is a guy called Professor Wendell Bell from Yale, and on the eve of independence 50 years ago, he was given a study by the U.S. government to study it's called nationhood, and he lived in Jamaica actually. Ivor Oxall was in Trinidad and Guyana. He later married a Guyanese, the young Wilson girl. But essentially what I did 2 years ago was 50 years after independence, Jamaica had their 50-50 conference, and my paper was selected. And essentially what I argued was that the microstates which currently exist in the Caribbean are too small, all right? So we've been able to have a modicum of political independence, but we've not been able to create a meaningful economic independence in the Caribbean because of the smallness of our size, these microstates. We cannot exist. CARICOM was, when I came back from California to New York, I replaced Ken Hall, who was actually at CARICOM, then he became the principal at Mona and the Governor General of Jamaica. And I saw Ken for the first time in 2012, and he's done a whole bunch of books in this area. He actually agreed with me. We meaning the Caribbean area, and that's, President Bush has said the same, President Obama, we can only survive if we come together as an economic federation, all right? Now, we've tried to do this with the Caribbean Court of Justice in other areas, but unless there's some economic federation, the Caribbean societies will still be, they cannot survive. It's not possible at all. And there'll be continued movements towards out-migration. Jamaica has one of the highest debt ratios in the world. Listen carefully, Jamaica. Yes. All right. The other small islands, St. Kitts, Barbados is tremendously dependent on tourism. All right, and so we really need a better way to integrate economically. And I'm not an economist, so I couldn't speak of what format that should take. But I think we're hearing those thoughts in the Caribbean now, and in much of the work of Ken Hall and with his co-authors, we're seeing this come through now. But that perspective.
Let's take the four most populous states. Barbados, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and Jamaica.
Yes.
In the context, why have they not been able to adopt a federated policy?
I'd say basic trust, political leadership. Political leadership is one. Trinidad is doing quite well, actually. In the human development scale, they rank higher than Barbados. They have an industrial base, oil, okay? They also have the Caribbeanization of tourism, okay, Carnival, of course, okay, SOCA. Okay, so they've been able to ally that with the industrial base, and many of the entrepreneurial activities emanating from the Caribbean comes out of Trinidad. In Barbados, for instance, so Trinidad is doing relatively well. Barbados is heavily dependent on tourism and offshore banking, and that's taken a hit. That's taken a hit tremendously. And they're going through some tremendous economic crises now. We don't hear much about it. Even crime has risen somewhat in Barbados. Not a lot, but it's risen some. As far as Jamaica and Guyana are concerned, I don't know. Jamaica's problem, of course, is the debt problem, which has inflicted them for years and has not been solved. Okay, on the different types of government, Siaga, Manley, doesn't seem to matter. PJ. And in terms of Barbados, I would argue that Barbados is still finding itself in the throes of an economic downturn. So I think we still need to figure that out. And Ralph Gonzalez, the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, I forgot his name, they're trying to find ways to do so. I was in Grenada 2 years ago, again attending a conference that came up. Grenada, as a matter of fact, on the plane was a young gentleman from Barbados, from the Caribbean Development Bank, who was now with the World Bank, and he was going to give some conditions to the Grenadian government as far as what they needed to do to get IMF loans. So we're still in a tremendous economic malaise in the Caribbean, and I'm not very. That is why it leaves an opening for drugs and these other institutional forces.
You know, I find when I have conversations with young people from the various countries, there's an understanding of the importance of adopting a federated policy or come together as a union for the Caribbean.
Yes.
That's among the young, and not so young population. Do you think that this kind of trust will come from the ground up rather than the governments down if it were supposed to happen? Something like the Arab Springs, well, that is not necessarily a good comparison, but
Yeah.
do you think it has to come from the people up pushing for this?
I think that I believe the diaspora can play a role in that regard. If you have people in the diaspora who are economic entrepreneurs who are willing to invest building hospitals or building radio stations or building hotels, okay, if they have that kind of clout, they can deliver a message to the political actors. They can certainly do so. The same might happen with professional associations. If Seventh-day Adventist, I know some friends of mine who are Seventh-day Adventist doctors, they go to Guyana, and if they're willing to rebuild the Seventh-day Hospital, my mom, I remember, had her surgery there before she immigrated. It's now not in good shape. But so my point is, if these actors, be they economic or social actors, Rihanna, can have an influence on the old political actors, there will be change. And that apparently has happened to some extent in Barbados. But I'm not so sure it's happened in Jamaica or Trinidad or Guyana. There is a unit, as I said, in the Foreign Service Office in Guyana, but how that unit functions and whether its efficacy, I really could not comment on.
You know, I feel kind of silly asking you this question, but I must ask it. Is egalitarianism dead in the region? And if not, is it possible in Guyana?
That's a tough one. It's really a tough one. Guyana is, it's a dear land of Guyana. I love that place. There needs to be more professionalization in many avenues. The police force, there needs to be more reaching across the board from both the PNC and the coalition governments and the PPP. And there needs to be a real manifestation of leadership, and that hasn't occurred. And what confunds it all is the challenge of narcotics and terrorism, and not a terrorism in Ghana, but narcotics and organized crime. And I think those are two major challenges, which makes us almost a pariah state. I mean, I do traveling, and I have some kind of clearance, like I don't want to get into details, but many times the guys look at your passport, they see Guyanese, and you give them an extra look. Unless, of course, you've got another type of clearance. That's really a stigma that really hurts Guyanese tremendously. Mm-hmm. And there needs to be a way of moving beyond this. I would argue that this can happen, but it has to happen with the diaspora. It can't be done alone by the political actors in the country.
Talking about the diasporas, there's a large Afro-Caribbean presence throughout the diasporas. If America had not adjusted its immigration policies, would England have been the beneficiary of or the primary beneficiary of this mass exodus?
No, Canada. Yes.
And why is that so?
Because I think Canada actually is the best of both worlds. You've got a quasi, I wouldn't say socialist system, but a system that's much less attuned to capitalistic mode than the US of A. Let me give you a good example. If you go to University of Toronto, Alberta, you pay maximum $12,000 for here. It's at a state school, it's $40,000, all right, or more. Okay, so the avenues of social mobility are much easier in Canada than they are here. It's very cold, all right. You got a relatively good standard of living, okay. I would say that Canada is a good bet, and it certainly ranks very high in the human development scale. So I think Canada would have been the beneficiaries. Canada has a different immigration policy though, and they have a point system, which means that you've got to be a plumber, you've got to have some special skill or profession to go there. So the tendency of you're not contributing are much less so in the Canadian immigration system than in America, which tends to use the preference system. You marry, you're a first, So in a sense, the American immigration system is actually skewed against itself. And that's part of the challenge we have now in trying to reform the immigration system. I'm not sure they'll move to a point system, but we find much of that happening in the H-1B visas, etc., in the US of A. So I think that system is our system is in the midst of some potential changes, and which might mirror or reflect the Canadian system.
Can you give us three positive benefits of remittances to the region?
It helps. It provides a level of comfort, level of ease for people in the donor society. Okay, it can provide a level of leisure. All right, and also provides essential services, hospital services, schooling, school fees. So I think economic certainly. Leisure or social and health, I'd say, are the three main beneficiaries in the Caribbean.
Let's take Guyana, for instance.
Yes.
What do you say to those who are of the opinion or the view that remittances undermine the ability or willingness of locals to push for positive political change?
No, I think that's too strong. Some would argue that's an unintended effect. It's like, no, I think I would look at it mainly in terms of the positive effects. Being able, I recall, as I said, in the early days, my uncle, not uncle, my cousin Albert, he worked on the sailing ships at that time, who would go ply between Guyana and England. And in Wales, and I've got relatives in Wales, right? And I call them when I go to England. But even in those days, people came back and brought some element of skills or sent monies back home. Okay. Now we see it so on a massive scale. Nigel Powell, Western Union. I mean, there needs to be some sort of remittances to help people who are disadvantaged economically. So I see remittances playing a very, very important role. Now, whether they lead to a sense of indolence, I don't support that argument at all.
I see. What would you say, or what are your thoughts on the socioeconomic and sociopolitical costs to the region due to remigration of criminal elements?
That's a tough one. In many instances, I do some work for persons who are after you've done 1/3 of your sentence, you're actually sent back. And the major problem we found was that if the U.S. government had not, in many instances, the donor societies were reluctant to take these individuals back. There have been cases where, not so much here, but in Canada and England, the planes would just leave them, fly back and leave them there. Now it's much easier, for instance, in the US of A, if it's in the eastern region, you're sent to Arctic Kill. There are arrangements made with the local government, be it Trinidad, Guyana, Barbados, Haiti, to see that the person at least is surveilled for a while and that there's some element of financial support. Okay? Now, in many instances, that's a concern because the governments are doing, the police forces are quite small. They themselves have elements of corruption, all right? And the main concern of Canada or the US of A is that this person or from Haiti or from Guyana does not return, okay? And so that's a major, major concern of the consul and the ambassadors in that regard. Mm-hmm. One ambassador, Roy Austin, who was actually a colleague of mine and was actually a classmate of President Bush at Yale, so I became very friendly. He was ambassador, in Trinidad and Tobago, and that was a major concern, major concern. Now, what they try to do is have the Drug Enforcement Agency within these countries as one major unit, but Guyana has not agreed to that, although I hear inklings now that they're prepared to have a DEA agency in Guyana. That's true in Jamaica and Barbados and other islands.
Let me just shift to the chat room a bit. Daryl asked, what can we do to build trust? Why is it limited to Susu size? That is, small groups of 5 to 10 people.
Well, as I said, trust you can build trust through professional associations. If you're a commentator or a cricketer or somebody who's an economist or there are persons of Indian and Chinese extraction who go together and work together as teams. I know such teams. I know many of those teams, right? Mainly providing health services. So that's one way. Building professional associations, doctors, lawyers, professors, Lair Matthews, who, by the way, has written an excellent book on remittances, and let me read it for you. Desmond Roberts has a piece in there. Where the hell is the book? Lair is a trained clinician. He's a professor at the SUNY Empire State, and he goes pretty frequently and trains social workers at the University of Guyana. So trust can be built. If you've been to school with somebody at Queens or Central or Saints, you have a basic. I have a basic trust with my kindergarten buddy. Okay, so trust can be built, but it's got to be at the what we call the primary levels, and not at the secondary levels of simply political organizations. That's a challenge for Guyana.
Mm-hmm. And Daryl asked again, larger structured organizations could work if there was confidence in systems and philosophy. Let me reread this. Sorry, Daryl. Larger structured organizations could work if there was confidence in systems and philosophy or moral code. And then Daryl asked, can we legalize drugs as it's now too late to win the war?
I think for Guyana it is, because even here that's still an ongoing debate, the legalization of drugs. You know, there's a big debate in California, in Washington, Washington and California. I was there in California. I spent 9 years there, 7 and 2, and there was a major concern in California as to the legalization of drugs. As a matter of fact, Governor Brown was governor at the time, and I can't see that happening in Guyana because we're a major transshipment point. Not just Guyana, Jamaica, Trinidad. Yeah, I think America sees that as a challenge to its legitimacy, and I don't think they'll go for that at all, really. So I don't think that's an area. But I think that in terms of moral code, yes, there has to be more. The political elite needs to find ways of getting together. Whether the guys went to Saints together or Queen, you don't have that kind. Chetty and Forbes, they weren't enemies. They might have been political rivals. Hell, Chetty Forbes was godfather for Joe before he died. Okay, so we don't have that political trust in Guyana. As I said, Forbes and Soretta Ramphel. I went to school with Jim Ramsahoy. They called me Aunt Coco. We didn't hate each other because we had different political views. That element of trust is missing in among the political elite in Guyana, and I think that's a problem. They see themselves as largely secondary groups and not primary groups.
How would you say is the African or the Asian and European immigrant different from the West Indian immigrant in regards to repatriation?
That's a tough one.
And the reason why I asked this question, because there seemed to be a sort of culture of returning home from certain African states, certain European nations. When the students come over here and study, they go back and do nation building, and of course China, Asian countries like China, Singapore, and so on.
Right.
Is that?
But this happened in Guyana. My point was, most of the migration occurred in, at least of so-called professional migrants. We left in the 1960s. Many of us returned. What is it? Samuel Tross, Louis Hampstead, I can name it. Fisher Yates. All those guys returned. Steve Backer. So there was this return in Guyana. But again, in many instances, I wouldn't say corruption. The promises were made that weren't filled. This was under the Burnham regime. Okay, the same is happening now. I've got friends whose name I can't call, and they're not even Afro-Guyanese who are leaving and returning. So I think to some extent that's a challenge in diaspora. The diasporic facility or flexibility has not been maximized in Guyana, and it takes a skill to do so. And that skill, I know we're trying. That skill has to be located somewhere. In Guyana, it's in the Foreign Service. In Jamaica, I think they have a special unit to do so. When you look at countries that have done well, like Asia, India, China, they have units to do this. They work with the diaspora. They try to facilitate the transfer of personnel. That is not happening in the Caribbean at all.
Would you say Caribbeans have a moral, a cultural, a social obligation to give back to the region for its development?
Yes. And they do. My point is, it's not done to the extent or to the maximum scale that it should be done. As I said, I've got, and I'm not using myself as an example, There are many, many friends of mine who go back to Guyana. Indians, I just gave you names: Sukram, Bertie Saunders. This other guy, he's orthodontic. And at all levels, nurse practitioners, nurses, physicians, and they're willing to go home. So it's not quick, but they do not find, for instance, many times they find that persons at home are jealous of them, of their success, and they throw barriers, okay? So there's not been that facility in terms of their welcome. This friend of mine said that he does most of his service in Berbice, right? But he wanted to use, he was also at the best hospital. He wanted to use Georgetown Hospital, and the Minister of Health threw so many barriers in his way. It took him two tours to get this accomplished. On the second tour, he couldn't get the same doctors to perform the services. So it's stuff like that needs not to happen in Guyana, really.
Who can or what can change that culture or shift that paradigm where there is more cohesiveness or cohesive relationship between expatriates and locals?
There's got to be a give and take. There needs to be organizations established not just in the ministries but also here in the whole society. Mm-hmm. So you find among the successful ones in Dominican republics or Chinese or Indians, there are organizations existing here that facilitate Indians leaving the Silicon Valley and returning home. Okay, so these organizations need to exist. The same is true with Mexicans and Latin Americans. Organizations need to exist not just in the donor society, but in the host society. And we don't have that here. Okay, we don't have this mixing between Afro-Indians and Indo-Guyanese. It doesn't happen. In a few organizations it does, maybe QC, Saints, but the Guyana Cultural Association is the only organization I know who's doing that, who's trying its best to facilitate that effort. But that thrust does not exist within the US of A.
I think about a year ago, Bonnie Yals was on the show, and unfortunately we didn't get to record it. And one of the things he was arguing, is that we need to preserve our heritage, the Guyanese heritage.
Yes.
But what he was doing was shifting the blame on the people to be curious enough to find out what they don't know or what exists. But the reason why I brought this up as an example is to ask you this. Mm-hmm. This is an education for me, and I'm sure for many of our listeners, as to what needs to be done. Is there an effort of this message? Is there a messaging, or does this message exist in any forum that you visit, Aubrey?
We're here or at home?
Here. I mean, we have
It does. I just gave the example. The Guyana Cultural Association, Vibrant Cambridge, Lair Matthews, many of these. I think that's a potential organization for doing this kind of, and it does it. That's certainly one. It has a journal. It works with the younger Guyanese, second and third generations. From an artistic level, from an educational level, we do mentorship. I'm not as active as I was before, but yes, it's been doing so for years, and that's just one organization. Okay, I know the bishops' organization. They're coming. So it happens among the what we call the hometown associations. Clonbrook, Buxton has a similar. So it happens not on the same massive scale as say Jamaica, but certainly we do a pretty good job in Guyana. The fact is, how does that transfer or translate in terms of the home society, in terms of Guyana? I think when you get to Guyana, that's where the major drawback is. And they're trying, certainly, by certainly placing that facility in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but I'm not sure that it's working as well as it should.
I want to borrow your professorial skills for a moment with this hypothetical. You're in a classroom, and you have as your audience perhaps a dozen or two young people,
yes,
from the various diasporas or the various countries in the regions, and you want to impress upon them the importance of cohesiveness, the importance of working towards a federated, homogeneous region. What would be your appeal?
I would argue that they should return either as Peace Corps volunteers, which some of them have, okay, peaceful volunteers, or at minimum, as exchange students, which some of them have. We have, for instance, my college is part of a large system. It's very small. We have an exchange with Barbados, and we're trying to extend to Guyana. When I was the vice president, the then Chancellor Tom Bartlett was trying to do. He didn't last very long, but he was trying to have an exchange whereby students from Guyana would come and do work at our college in Farmingdale. So that kind of stuff should be maximized by the University of Guyana and the regions. I know, for instance, that in 2007 or 2006, Vice Chancellor, the current Vice Chancellor, Nigel Harris, was doing the same, was trying to do the same with the University of Guyana, with JAGO, trying to have that kind of exchange. So that's certainly one avenue. Yeah. So I tell my students that all the time. We need to use, we do so for Chinese students, have many Chinese students studying at Old Westbury. We do so for students from England, and Manchester and Sussex. They come and do a year. We need to do the same in the Caribbean. And we, as I said, our small unit in this large system have been able to do so in Barbados. And we'd love to do so in Guyana. I mean, I couldn't speak for the president, but I know we have a very, very strong thrust within the SUNY system for the international affairs and student affairs in that regard, and that's part of connections.
Aubrey, you know, I always marvel at how time sorts of cheats us when we're having fun.
Yes.
And an hour and a half seems so long when you mention it to a potential guest, but then as the conversation persists, time seems insufficient.
This has been very good. This has been very, very good, and you should do this again.
We should. I have some more questions I want to ask you, but they are quick questions.
Sure.
First, when are you most happy?
When I'm helping others. My wife can tell you, I'm always, I've been so blessed with mentorship at all levels, and I've just given you so I tend to be happy when I'm helping others. Yeah, really
what is gratifying about being Aubrey Bonnett?
Just being myself, trying to exist in this world, and trying to see my grandchildren grow. And keeping my old lady happy.
What are you most proud of?
What am I most proud of? The way I've been able to influence lives. As I said, my ability to influence students, be they police officers, intelligence, you name it, judges, at every level. Mm-hmm. Every level I've helped, and I'm just proud of that. That I've been able to. I've been helped by many persons. Many are, some, not all. Some are still alive, and I try to pay back, so to speak, and that makes me very proud in that regard.
Finish this sentence for us. I look forward to Sunday evenings to.
Sundays.
Sunday evenings.
To read and to catch up on my reading.
What are you most thankful for?
Good health. A loving life,
uh-huh.
and a sense of economic sufficiency. I'm sufficiently blessed, I would say, economically.
Amen. If
Yes.
you could go back in time, what would you tell that 16-year-old boy?
I've always been fascinated with doing law, quite honestly. I'm a frustrated lawyer, and I might do some courses. I've done a little, but I wish I could relive my life. I'd be a lawyer, really. Maybe a judge, but as I said, I was admitted to Lincoln's Inn and to Columbia, NYU here, but did not pursue law, and that's I still. What if? What if?
What if, right?
Yes.
Daryl in the chat room said, "Very good. Thank you, Aubrey. We will talk again."
Thank you, sir.
And
this has been good.
And this is the last question, one I ask all my guests.
Yes, sir.
And what makes you laugh out loud?
A good old Guyanese joke, man.
Well, Aubrey, thank you.
And I have lots of those. I have a good buddy who's actually Bajan. His name is Calvin Holder. And calling him and then shooting the breeze, that really gets me.
Well, as I said earlier to you is when we were doing a setup that I had to ask you permission or how to address you, because of how we were raised. You know, it is
Yeah,
very.
yeah, I know. But listen, I'm just a regular homeboy, you know, trying to survive in Babylon. Listen.
Well, thank you so very much for indulging us with your time and your eloquence and sharing your experience and knowledge with us. Thank you.
Sir.
And you will be coming back because as I said, we didn't have enough time.
Well, I'll do it in the fall. How about
Okay,
that?
wonderful,
Thank you.
wonderful, wonderful. So good night.
Thank you, Seven. Good night. Bye-bye now.
Bye bye.